filming to the world.
I'll stand casually in the background. I'll cower here behind the podium, and that will make it all better.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first housekeeping item, as many of you know, I do not need a microphone, but we're using microphones today because we're live streaming. So this is available to our collaborators across the other hub campuses, River Falls and Platteville, and some of them will be presenting later on. So first, welcome. Thank you for coming. One of the very exciting parts of working on the Dairy Innovation Hub launch the last few years has been hiring new faculty across departments in our college, as well as the colleges of agriculture, they have different names, at UW-Platteville and River Falls. And in fact, we've hired 14 new faculty already across the 3 campuses. So the steering committee, myself, our program manager, Maria Wolt, we've all been very busy working towards that. And so in thinking about bringing all these new faculty to campuses, one of the things we wanted to do was have an opportunity for them to share what they're working on with others in the college, and specifically to help foster collaborative opportunities. So today launches our new faculty hub-funded faculty lecture series, or seminar series, if we will. And they'll be held monthly during the academic year. So we have Chuck Nicholson today starting us off. So I'll give you a little bit of background. As a note, if you didn't get coffee and cheese sticks on your way in, please feel free to run back out and get those or get some afterwards. Okay? Go right now, hurry. I'll do the intro while you get one. Okay. So, no, well, we'll see. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm pleased to introduce Chuck. He was our first hub-funded faculty hire here at Madison, so we were very excited to have him join us. He's an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics, specializing in dairy economics and agribusiness related specifically to U.S. and Wisconsin dairy supply chain, dairy markets, and policy. He officially started his role in January, although I can tell you firsthand he has been contributing to hub efforts since last fall. So Chuck has spent more than 20 years working as an agricultural economist, a business analyst, and food system modeler. More recently, prior to joining UW, he worked at 3 business schools: the Nijmegen School of Management in the Netherlands, Cornell University, and Penn State University. His main research goals are to apply the tools of economics, business, and systems modeling to provide information relevant to decision-making by dairy stakeholders in Wisconsin and at the national level. So please welcome Chuck.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you those live streaming who are not here with us in person. Glad to have you all here. So this is really a presentation that's designed to provide sort of an illustration of the kind of work that I do. And it's also a story about how 2 agricultural economists collaborated with 2 dairy nutritionists to answer a relatively practical question about feeding dairy cows. So my agenda looks something like this. I'm going to give you a little bit of personal background. I'll spare you all the details maybe that Heather gave you, but a few things that might be helpful for interpreting what I'm about to talk about. Then I'll get into talking about the study itself, what we did, what we found, and then at the end, I think part of the idea is to have some opportunity for discussion, potential collaborations, in addition to questions that you might have. Okay. So this is a little bit of background that says I've worked on dairy issues in a lot of different places. From the top picture there, a very much younger version of me, believe it or not, that actually is me, on a smallholder dairy farm in coastal Kenya. Worked on dairy issues in 4 key U.S. states that are important to the dairy industry, and also worked internationally in both Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. The bottom picture, where you can see that everyone is really excited to see what I have to say, is actually when I was giving information to the Dairy Industry Advisory Committee in the South Building of USDA back in 2011. Part of it is I'm trying to say there's a diverse set of environments and perspectives that I've had the opportunity to engage in, and that's part of what's reflected in what I'll talk about this afternoon. So the other part that I'll share, and this is kind of my version of the combination of a weird, Venn diagram and a word cloud kind of thing, where it actually talks about the different things that I do, because there's a fair dairy component to a lot of the work that I've done, but there's some other things that I've done as well that include things on the instruction side, that include interactions with the environment. And in particular, it was mentioned that I do a lot of food system modeling type work, and so that tends to underpin a lot of the things that I'll talk about, including some of the things that I'll talk about today. Right? And around the edges are kind of the overarching goals that I often see for the work that I have. Heather has also mentioned that it informs decision making is one of the key things that I'm often interested in being able to do. Okay. So with that in mind, let's talk about the objectives of this particular study. And I mentioned that it involved some dairy nutritionists and it involves some economists. So the first part is really more focused on the dairy nutrition part, which is basically, let's review the evidence about whether or not it makes sense or is feasible to feed a particular feed, in this case high-oleic soybeans, to dairy cattle. And so what we're particularly interested in is what the impacts are on the production of milk fat, which has value in the marketplace. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then once we've identified kind of the biological mechanisms of potential, we'll think a little bit about some basic economic analysis at the level of an individual cow, which is often something that dairy producers are interested in, and at the level of a farm, so scaling it up a bit. And then finally, we'll also think about the broader scaling up implications if we take this up to the level of a marketplace or a supply chain. Okay? And I should point out, importantly, if I can get that nice little cursor thing, that this work was funded in part by the folks that get the checkoff dollars for soybean, the United Soybean Board. Okay? So the basic methods overview looks like this. For the purposes of understanding the biological implications of feeding high-oleic soybeans to dairy cattle, Lou Armitano, longtime faculty member here at UW, Kevin Havertine at Penn State, looked at the available literature and created a synthesis, and I'll talk more about what they found and what some of the limitations were about that in a second. We then actually looked at a fairly simple kind of budgeting approach to think about what would be the additional revenue that would be generated from the milk fat that comes from feeding high-oleic soybeans, and then think about the additional costs that are associated with making that milk fat production happen. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the simulation modeling tool that we use to try and understand the scaling up and supply chain implications of this particular approach. Okay. So the review of literature looks a little bit like this, and there are a few papers, and I know I don't see João here, but he's actually one of the guys who has done some work on this with Lou. But there are a number of studies that have been done in recent years that have been trying to look at particularly the milk yield, milk fat, milk composition effects of feeding this particular feed to dairy cattle. And in fact, a little bit intriguingly, based on conversations I was just having with you, Maren, there's also some impact apparently on enteric methane emissions. So there's the potential, at least from the perspective of the folks that are promoting high-oleic soybeans, that there may also be some environmental and economic win-wins here. So I mostly put this slide in here to see whether I could challenge myself to say the word biohydrogenation as an economist, but it also tries to explain a little bit about what, as I understand as a non-biochemist and not really a dairy nutritionist, to be the mechanism by which we get this higher milk fat produced by high-oleic soybeans. So the basic idea here that's shown in the graph is that as you feed more fat in a dairy cow ration, you tend to see this phenomenon called milk fat depression. And that is that the amount of milk, the milk fat yield, goes down. Okay, and my dairy nutritionist friends can correct me if I say anything that's really stupid here, so you'll help me out here. But what we see is if you change the composition of the fat that's fed in the diet, it actually has an impact, and you see there's a blue line there and a red line. The blue line is basically saying if we feed more of the oleic acid and less of the linoleic acid, we actually get less of that milk fat depression, and that's kind of the biochemical mechanism, as much as I understand it, that leads to higher milk fat production in the dairy cow. Okay? And in fact, there's a specific meta-regression that was done on the available data that suggests what that empirical relationship is. And it turns out we're going to use that as a part of our understanding of the costs and benefits of doing this particular feeding strategy. Okay? So this leads us to talk a little bit about why we would think high-oleic soybeans would be better. And the basic idea is they've got a lot of oleic acid that's in place of the linoleic acid. And so otherwise, they tend to have similar compositions in the soybeans, so they can be substituted in the diet. They have agronomically similar yields, according to at least some people, but not everyone agrees with that. And I'm not really sure, this is actually directly from Lou, I'm not sure why he mixed his units there with 1 pound and then the grams of the fatty acids, but I'm going to go with it. But basically what we're seeing here is there's a very different composition of these soybeans, and they have more of the thing that should depress milk fat less. And so they otherwise are fairly similar in terms of the nutritional values, and so it was sort of an obvious choice to think about making that kind of substitution without thinking there might be too many other kinds of lingering negative effects. Okay, so the evidence really comes from 5 key feeding trials. And interestingly, I found out that there's a lot of variation, a lot of noise in the data. And so it's actually really sort of hard to really get a handle on what the impact is. There wasn't sufficient data to do sort of a full meta-analysis. The average across these 5 different trials was a 65 gram per day increase in butterfat at about a 5% inclusion of this soybean in the diet while substituting in for some other elements. Yeah? So the evidence is, I would not say, overwhelmingly compelling and solid. But eventually what we did was we used that information about the average response plus the meta-analysis about what would happen if we substituted out the linoleic acid and put in the oleic acid, and we used that to benchmark what we would expect the change in milk fat production to be. So this actually shows one of the studies that kind of provides a little bit of the basic findings for many of them, that there wasn't much change in the overall production of milk, but that the composition of the milk was altered to be much more significantly more, statistically significantly more grams per day and proportion of fat in the milk. Okay? So let's then talk about how we use this to come up with really this kind of more budgeting-oriented analysis. So we're going to use the idea of a change in milk income less feed costs. So basically we're going to look at 2 elements, the change in the value of fat produced in the milk, and many of you may know that at least in most parts of the United States, milk is priced on the basis of components, so if you have more of a valuable component like fat, you're going to receive a higher milk price. So we're going to account for that value. And then we're also going to subtract from that any change in cost that's associated with feeding high-oleic soybeans, and I'll talk in a minute about the other things that we needed to do to modify the diet. Okay? So, and the change in the value of the fat is pretty basic. It's a change in milk fat production. And this is actually at the level of grams per cow per day, times the butterfat value. So the butterfat value is actually going to come from the regulated system of pricing that we have in the United States under what are called federal milk marketing orders, and that's going to be actually how we will assign a value to that, because that's how it would be assigned to a dairy producer receiving a milk check. And we also have a change in feed cost. I mentioned partly that's we need to feed more of the high-oleic soybeans. There's a price premium on those. And there's also a change in the cost to have additional amounts of energy available in the dairy cow's ration to allow for that extra production of the 50 grams of fat, which requires energetic mobilization, energetic supply to be able to do that. So this is actually a fairly simple, straightforward set of calculations where really the only things we have to think a little bit about are how are we costing feed, how are we pricing the butterfat, and how much additional energy do we need to add to the diet in order to account for that additional dry matter intake. Okay. But one of the key things, many of you may know, but the prices of both feed and butterfat have been tremendously variable, even up until this day. We were looking at a time period starting in 2014. We had very high milk and feed prices. We've gone through all kinds of crazy changes since then. So the variation actually becomes a really important part of understanding whether this might be a good idea, because under certain market conditions it might be good, and under others it might not be. And so that's what we wanted to try and explore by looking at this variation. So we assumed basically that we were going to feed a certain amount of high-oleic soybeans in the ration. And at the time we were doing the study, it was fairly common to have a 50-cent per bushel premium on high-oleic beans compared to conventional soybeans. And I'm not really a soybean guy, but I spent a little bit of time thinking about how the premium structures would work. And then we had additional dry matter intake valued at a certain energy content that was necessary, and we costed that based on what I'm calling there the DMC ration. There's an incredible variation in dairy rations that are fed on dairy farms in Wisconsin, even within Wisconsin and around the country. So we're using kind of a national average ration value to cost out the changes in dry matter intake that are necessary. And that's a bit of an approximation because it may represent not any one farm, but it captures the general trends in the pricing and the availability of feeds. Okay? And then most importantly, the distribution of butterfat values, the butter price, if you will, has been tremendously variable in the last 10 years, really, all the way from $1.40 a pound to $3.40 a pound. And so you might guess that if we were at a spot like this and we're getting additional butterfat in the milk, there's sort of less value when that butterfat is at a low value. And if we're up here, when it's a very high value, that actually creates much more additional revenues for the farm. So we wanted to explicitly account for that variation in looking at what we costed this out for. Okay, so here's the basic results on this when we think about this on a per cow per day basis. And actually, I said we were going to assume this 50 grams per cow per day as a starting point. But me being the kind of cautious belt and suspenders kind of guy that I am, I said, let's actually think about getting less than 50 grams. And so we did some what you might call sensitivity or scenario analysis where we looked at getting 45 grams per day and 40 grams per day to see what difference it would make while maintaining the assumptions about additional feed that was required to produce that amount. All right? So the basic storyline is the mean impact on this looks like this, and it is positive for all those different levels of additional fat generated, and it's actually positive over all of the time periods that we were looking at from 2014 to 2020. The minimum values show that there are no negative values there. It's better if you have a higher milk fat price, and it's better if you have more additional milk fat produced, but the basic bottom line is that you have a distribution across all that time period that actually looks more something like this. And this graph has actually basically got the three different assumed fat increase levels, and it's showing the distribution of returns based on the changes in the feed values and the butterfat values. And again, the distribution gets shifted to our right if we're thinking about producing more milk fat per cow, but it's always above zero. Okay, so this is some at least initial evidence that suggests that under a lot of different market conditions, it would increase the milk income over feed costs to feed high-oleic soybeans. Okay? All right, so we can then take that and sort of scale it up to the level of maybe not quite a farm, but at least some group of cows on a farm. And all the studies that I'm aware of use sort of mid-lactation cows, and they used Holsteins. So this suggests that there's probably some scope for additional work, but it also suggests that we may not want to trust feeding early lactation cows or late lactation cows, so we might not want to feed all our cows on a farm high-oleic soybeans. So instead of sort of thinking about the structure of a herd and how much of it, what proportion was going to be fed, we kind of said, well, okay, let's just think about what this would mean if we were feeding this number of cows. And if we look at the amount per cow per day and we look at the number of cows, we can readily calculate what the values are at a farm level for doing these things. You can see those numbers go from relatively small, 6,000, to actually kind of what I'd like to be my annual salary, or maybe Victor's annual salary. But also we have here how much high-oleic soybean will be used. That's some sense of the possibilities or feasibility for it, and how much acreage would be required if they were planting that on their own farm. Okay, so we're trying to give a little bit of a sense for the feasibility through doing this. So if you look at a value like 6,523, it's a little bit hard to say, is that a big number or a small number? So one of the things that we might do is put it on the basis of what would be the average net farm operating income for a dairy farm with a certain number of cows. So from some other analyses we've done and some modeling work we've done, for a cow, a farm with about 250 cows, milking cows per year, we might expect on an average year over this time period, their net farm operating income might be around $50,000 per year. So if that is about the average amount, and we can increase that by about $6,500, that's actually a fairly substantive percentage increase that would get people's attention if they were to learn that that would be a possible increase in their net farm operating income. Okay, so far, what I've talked about is illustrated a little bit by this set of kind of little causal linkages I have here. We said basically we got some evidence that milk fat increases. We valued that at a market value. We got additional revenues. And then we took into account some of the additional feed costs down here and looked at the impacts on farm profitability. Okay? So that actually, I call it an economic analysis, but really it's more like an accounting analysis, or actually my accounting friends probably get mad if I said that. We'll call it a budgeting analysis, okay? And the key thing is that economics is not really so much about like putting cost numbers on something. It's really about thinking of the behavioral responses that economic incentives give people and how they then change and respond to those economic incentives. So as you might guess, based on the way I've structured this diagram, there's some other stuff that I'm going to put in there in a minute. And that stuff really looks like this, okay? So there's a much more complicated network of connections that we should probably think about if we're going to take this more into the realm of economic analysis, which is really to think about, hey, if this is such a great idea and dairy farmers are saying, I'm going to be much more profitable if I do this, there's likely to be some kind of response that they say, oh, I'm going to tell other farmers about doing this. There may be more widespread adoption, assuming there aren't particular constraints to the use of this, and we'll talk more about what some of those could be going forward. And that's going to change, actually, a number of factors that condition whether or not this could be a good idea. And I've actually explicitly drawn this as a kind of a feedback type effect to represent the adoption, scaling up, and market effects. So here, if this is great for farm profitability and farmers know it and have access to high-oleic soybeans, we would expect that more of them might do that. We think about that as maybe a good thing from the perspective of the United Soybean Board, who, by the way, spent between $80 and $100 million developing varieties of high-oleic soybeans and would like to see some kind of payoff on an aggregated scale from doing that. So the scaling up and the use of high-oleic soybeans basically is going to produce more milk fat. So we have an increased supply of milk fat available in the marketplace. That is likely to have at least some offsetting effect on the value of butterfat in the marketplace, which then directly looks at what the revenue gains would be on the farm. So there's an offsetting effect on revenues, and if we have an offsetting effect on revenues for the same feed cost, we would see some kind of offsetting effect on farm profitability. And this is actually, this kind of thinking is not at all new. I mean, Willard Cochran talked about a technology treadmill back in the late 1950s, and there's some elements of that, but this actually kind of informs how we should probably think a little bit about the dynamics of technology development and adoption to account for these kind of what we might think of as secondary market or scaling up effects. Okay. So with that in mind, let's think a little bit about how we're going to try and address the fact that we might expect there would be some offsetting effects. And in this particular case, we're going to use a dynamic simulation model of the global dairy supply chain that was developed over a long number of years by Mark Stevenson and myself that actually captures a good deal of the detail that's relevant to understand this. So it's actually got 5 different farm size categories across different regions of the world, including 10 here in the United States. We have cows and milk per cow herd dynamics being represented. We have the processing sector, and importantly, we have component balancing taking place through the cream and skim that gets generated when farm milk ends up in a dairy plant. Captures the demands and availability and inventory holdings of 23 different dairy products. Captures both domestic demand responses and export demand across 14 external regions to the U.S. and includes the relevant policy instruments here in the United States, federal milk marketing orders, and the Dairy Margin Coverage Risk Management Program. Okay. And I've shown this with some things that maybe look a little funny, but basically they're common stock flow feedback structure type relationships here showing things related to milk yields, cows, and butter inventories, and therefore butter prices. All right. So we're going to use this to help us understand if we put more milk fat out into the system, what's going to be the market response to that, and does it have a big enough depressing effect on the profitability that actually we should question whether or not this would be a good idea as a technology. So it turns out that when we do this, we don't know how many farms might choose to adopt this particular technology, and one of the issues with that will be the availability of high-oleic seed. But we basically tried to do, again, some experiments where we said, what if it's 5%? What if it's 10%? What if it's 25% of the dairy cows are fed with high-oleic soybeans, and we see the increase in milk fat that goes along with that? What are the market effects? And the bottom line is, you can look at those numbers there, but you're kind of probably already saying they look pretty small, and you'd be right. So the core idea here is that even when you account for those effects, there isn't a big enough price-depressing effect on butterfat prices that it actually changes the fundamental results that you get when you don't consider this. And in fact, there is some slight reduction in the market prices for dairy products that benefit consumers, which actually is often one of the folks that benefit most from the adoption and implementation of ag technologies. But also dairy processors and exporters would benefit from this particular approach. Okay, so the lower prices allow them to sell more, generate larger amounts of revenues, even though those effects are relatively small. But basically, we're talking about relatively positive effects. There is that offset. It is a negative value, but it's a small enough offset that it actually does not undermine the fundamental budgeting analysis that we did. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the scaling up, because you may say, wow, this is such a great idea. Why wouldn't everybody do it? And I said, there's a little bit of an issue of we need more evidence about whether or not this is really going to have the desired effect in all kinds of cows at different stages of lactation. But under current considerations, about 2 million acres of high-oleic soy would need to be planted to feed 50% of the U.S. dairy herd, the amounts that we were talking about, which is about 1.5 kilograms a day. Right? So when you look at it on the basis of there's about 80 million total acres of soybeans planted every year, you say, okay, that's not really a big deal, Chuck. On the other hand, though, there are significant limitations because we've never seen anywhere near that amount of high-oleic soybean planted. And the other thing is, we talked to farmers as a part of some focus groups related to this work, and they basically are saying, hey, I don't really want to buy this. I'd rather grow it myself and have control over it, from my field to my storage. So first, you need seed access for that. You need a land base that's going to be appropriate for growing the particular varieties that are available, and you may need some additional storage, all of which might involve additional costs that were not accounted for in the previous analysis that I talked about. All right. So I mentioned that we did talk to focus groups that included farmers and dairy nutritionists, and this is a relatively small number from 2 different focus group meetings that we had. But basically, there was a considerable amount of interest and a willingness to further explore the idea based on this scale of, are you unlikely to ever consider doing this versus are you very likely to do it? Again, very simple kind of question to ask somebody in a focus group. But essentially, there's a fair amount of positive interest in maybe being able to look at this as an idea. So one of the things I mentioned, though, is we've never actually had anywhere near 2 billion acres available. So to considerably scale up, maybe this helps to put it a little bit in perspective. These are 3 of the different high-oleic soybean varieties that are available. And the quantities are shown there, the number of acres that were available for planting in 2021. So you can see first that those numbers are small relative to the 2 million threshold. And also these are sort of designed to be geographically specific. So the 100,000 in Ohio is really about varieties that are probably going to grow well in Ohio, but they're not going to grow well in North Dakota. Okay? So we have actually some other work that we've been doing that tries to look at the supply chain coordination issues for the production of seed and the adoption of seed by dairy producers. We have a paper that's just about ready to be accepted at an agribusiness journal. But this is a considerable potential constraint because there are coordination issues and the adaptation of the varieties for the particular locations is going to be kind of important. Okay. So one other thing that we talked about in the focus groups that's relevant is the nutritionist, and maybe you can help me out if I'm going to say something stupid again, say that there may be benefits. The trials were often done using whole raw soybeans. And so that actually simplifies some things, but there's apparently the possibility that by roasting and milling a bit, you actually get a better response. So we talked a little bit about, okay, what would that cost on a farm to process a certain volume? And actually that probably means you're talking about $60,000 to $80,000 in initial investment to be able to do that, which for a small dairy farm is probably not going to work, but for a large dairy farm is probably more like something that would be rounding error on their accounting statements. So there's some potential there, particularly at larger scales, to think about that. One last thing, do we have anybody who works in dairy processing in the room? Okay. Since I don't know you, that's good. Basically, you're also going to change not just the fatty acid composition going into the rumen, you're also going to change the fatty acid composition of the milk. And so what I don't know, but I'd be interested to know more about, is whether or not somebody working in a dairy processing space would say, oh yeah, that butterfat is really good for what I want to do, making cheese or making butter or yogurt, or is not. So we haven't actually explored whether or not further down in the supply chain there could be potential issues that are related to the functionality of the composition of the milk fat, which is also changed by doing this. Okay, so that's another thing that's kind of on the agenda for the future. All right, so that is what I had to say, and it was almost about on time. Happy to take any questions about this. I also have some stuff that tells more about things I'm working on, but why don't you go, you lead it. So let's actually see if any questions first. Okay.
Hold on before I get Steve after me here. All right, so we'll start with any questions on this, with in mind that the main goal of this is to foster collaboration. So Chuck obviously read the homework. He just previewed. He has more slides. The goal is to share some of the things he has vision for and where collaborations might exist. So what he can bring to the table or what he's looking for in collaborations here. So we want to make sure to leave time for that, but we will take any questions you have. I will give a public service announcement because this trips up every person in this building. You must ask into the microphone. You must push the word push. Hold until the light turns green. Keep it depressed and lean into the microphone. It's more challenging than we might think. So, any questions on Chuck's seminar?
Jeremy, yes.
I have a question about the roasting process. It seems like when you talk about how farmers wanted to deal with these soybeans, they wanted control over the supply chain because, for quality reasons, presumably. And so I'm wondering whether the roasting process means, oh, okay, I can give up control over the supply chain because I can get better roasted beans.
Thank you for that question, Jeremy. I really didn't expect for an economist of your stature to be asking me a question about roasting and milling of soybeans, but I appreciate that. So, and that's not any kind of slight. I'm delighted to have that question. So, I think
next I'll ask about coffee beans.
Okay, great. So I think the idea is, yes, there's two reasons why farmers might want to do this. One is to control their own supply chain for this product for quality reasons in part, but also typically these beans are planted under a contract with one of the major oilseed processors, and that's who pays the premium, okay? So if you buy that from somebody else, you're going to incur that premium. If you grow it yourself, you may have some other opportunity costs associated with that, but you don't necessarily have to pay that premium in order to get that onto your farm. On the roasting and milling, I think the idea when I talked about the 60 to 80,000 was really that you would still control that process, and you would work in collaboration perhaps with your dairy nutritionist to figure out how that would best be incorporated into your ration. But you would still control it. You would make the investment in the roasting and milling equipment if you didn't already have that. There are mobile roasters and mobile millers that will go around and do that for you, but that does cede a little bit of control to the timing and the quality that you get out of doing that. Anyways, thanks for that. Hope that answered the question. Yes, please.
Denise Ney, I'm from Department of Nutritional Sciences, so
Lovely.
welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to your wife also.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a comment on the decreasing the linoleic acid, but increasing the oleic acid in the milk product, which I see as a positive, actually, from a nutritional standpoint. And I'm going to speculate that it will still be good for dairy processing, but the Center for Dairy Research, I think, could really help with that, reducing a highly unsaturated fat, such as linoleic acid. In a way, and I'm thinking maybe marketing it kind of makes it more like the Mediterranean diet, if you will, which is very high in oleic acid. My question is, what does this do to the linolenic acid content, the essential N3 fatty acid in these high-oleic beans? What does it do? Because what you could be doing here is changing the N6 to N3 ratio of the types of fat, and that is a very important feature in terms of if you can reduce that ratio or increase the proportion of the N3, these are less inflammatory.
Okay, that is an excellent question, and I have no idea what the answer is, at least not yet. So I'd be happy to try and look into that. I can go back and look at some of the additional compositional information that we have from the studies on the different beans that were fed, because I know they have some of the additional fatty acid composition data there, but I don't remember that off the top of my head. The other thing I'll say in response is you're absolutely right that the reason that the United Soybean Board spent $80 to $100 million developing these soybean varieties was not to feed dairy cows, it was to actually meet a market for additional shelf life, use life in frying applications that would use soybean oil, and also because of the potential for the high oleic oil products to have health benefits. And so they were trying to capture that much more than they were trying to think about feeding this to dairy cows. Because that market has not really taken off, at least in the soybean space, compared to, say, canola and sunflower oils, this is one of the reasons they're starting to say, hey, maybe we can feed some of this stuff to dairy cows, and actually that would be another mechanism for uptake that would generate sort of this critical mass for the further development of the varieties that have high oleic for soybean.
Thank you for sharing that. It just points to the interdisciplinary nature of some of these challenges and opportunities that we have to strengthen the Wisconsin dairy industry.
And I hope there's opportunities that go beyond just kind of the stuff we do to have that benefit other folks as well. And I think there may be some potential here for that.
Chuck, if I can jump in to add to Denise's question, I remember when these studies were done, I was new faculty here, and the graduate student did fatty acid composition work on samples from the cow, which I believe included milk samples. Although given the timing, I don't think it was included in her dissertation. We might have that data, even if it never made it into the papers where we could look to answer, Denise, your questions.
Okay, I think that'd be great. And to follow up with the folks at CDR to understand what the potential processing implications might be for this would be good.
One other comment. Is Joe Pierre here by any chance? Joe, are you here? Okay, he's speaking next month. But Joe has, I'm not going to steal his thunder, but he's got a really cool idea on what to do, a new market for milk fat. And so when I go look into your model in that nice circle where it's all going to shut down and feed back on itself like an enzyme system, same concept. You know, you could break that if you had new markets for milk fat.
So, excellent point. That if you think about things like what the U.S. Dairy Export Council is designed to do, they're all about growing export demand, and everything they put out is, we grew export demand by this much, and we're exporting this much more of our components. Okay, and I say, great, you're doing a wonderful job. The only thing I'll add a little bit that's along the lines of those loops is we are really good in the United States at making more milk whenever it is needed. We are way too good at making more milk because we don't have hardly any constraints. And so whenever there's a new market opportunity, we can easily overshoot it. And that's kind of been my experience doing work on, I've also done work with this kind of model looking at dairy promotion strategies. So what should we spend money on to get people to buy more of? Or what new products might we think about developing? The bottom line is we can just keep making more milk. And so that actually still creates a bigger industry. There's more money flowing to dairy farms, and there's more money flowing through dairy processors, and there's more product being enjoyed by consumers. But it's kind of not the same thing as saying we're taking everybody to this higher plane in terms of better profitability. So I'll just kind of make that point as one of the, we can easily outstrip just about any additional demand you can imagine, is my experience. I mean, sorry about that depressing news, Heather, but that's...
No, but Joe's idea is super cool, so...
Okay, well, I'll look forward to hearing it. I'll be there for it, and I will not throw too much cold milk on it. Okay. Okay. Actually, I don't want to make this, again, too much about me, but part of it, I think this is a little bit of an introduction and maybe thinking about potential points of collaboration. So let me go to this. This is another visually challenging kind of thing here, but all I'm trying to do with this is sort of say I've worked on a wide variety of different issues, many of which related to dairy, that range, again, everywhere from East Africa to wild places like California. So these are the kinds of things that I have been working on in the past, and I kind of highlight some green things that are outside of the U.S. and some more recent things that are within the U.S., primarily looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on dairy demand and its implications for the dairy supply chain in a couple different ways. But kind of more specifically, the things that I'm currently working on, and believe it or not, this is only kind of like a partial list, and it's almost embarrassing to put this much stuff up there because it makes it look like you're not focused on anything. But we do have some work where we're trying to look at what COVID-19 did to dairy supply chains and the implications of whether or not there's some lessons to be learned about resilience in the supply chain in the face of big shocks. There's a couple things looking at development of some large-scale models to look at spatial pricing of farm milk, which is part of our federal milk marketing order system. We have this system of Class 1 differentials that are based on the location values for milk going into fluid uses, so we're going to be doing some work at that. Updating that dynamic global supply chain model I just talked about with collaborations with the International Farm Comparison Network in Germany. I've been working on some dairy value chain investments and improvements in Tanzania, and then something completely unrelated to dairy that I'll just throw out there is looking at climate change and food and nutrition security that I have a GIH seed grant to look at here coming up in the fall. Have a number of proposed projects that are particularly collaborations with folks at Platteville and River Falls to look at cost of production. Just found out yesterday that our berries to export market participation has been funded by the short-term high-impact grants of the Hub, so thank you for that. And a couple other collaborations with Luis Peña-Delano at River Falls looking at the impediments to grazing adoption. And one last thing that kind of ties the circle on high-oleic soybeans is there are currently studies being done at Penn State and at Michigan State that are additional trials looking at additional cow groupings, additional incorporations into the rations. And those are things that USB is likely to come back and say, can we have a look at the economics in a way that is similar to what you've already done? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Questions, comments, potential connections?
So I have a question that's a little bit broader than just the soybean, but related to that.
Okay.
How you mentioned that how farms generate the feeds for their rations vary dramatically across farms. So how is, and this is probably far too broad of a question for this, but how are we currently accounting for the cost of feed, recognizing that some of those feeds are homegrown and some of them are purchased, and within a homegrown feed, depending on the size of the farm, they may be counting on free family labor, or they may be paying employees that are on payroll with benefits. And how do we get to that to a point where it's standardized enough that we can do these types of scenarios where we say, okay, this would be a value returned or this would not be?
Okay. So let me first say one thing about what we didn't do here, and then I'll come and answer more directly your question. So I mentioned that we basically, what we're doing is using what you might think of as sort of like a partial budgeting approach. We're changing some things, we're keeping a lot of things the same. When we talked about the feed costs, basically we said there's one feed cost that applies to all farms, and it's kind of like this average, you're going to use that, right? So there's a number of things wrong with that because the diversity of the different feeding strategies on farms and their production costs and purchase costs. But there's another thing that's wrong with that that's not like some least cost ration that we might envision a nutritionist trying to help somebody develop. It's just kind of this average ration cost. So one of the key limitations of this really is that we're not really accounting for the fact that our comparison is between this and that, when our comparison might really need to be between like this and that, okay? To come back to your question, I am not like a farm finance and accounting specialist of any kind, but I've spent enough time playing with farm records from the New York Dairy Farm Business Summary to know a little bit about how they evaluate cost of purchase feed is actually fairly straightforward when you do that. the costs of anything that's produced on the farm, or the owner and operator labor and management or family labor, always becomes a little bit of an arbitrary definition. In that context in New York, what they would basically do is they would say, what do you value your own labor at as an owner, operator, or manager? Or they would ask, what do you value your family labor at? Okay, so there's a little bit of an issue trying to standardize that. But once you get past those things, you make those definitions, you can actually come up with something that looks like an accounting for things that were purchased on the farm as feed and things that were produced on the farm. And you can also account for the fact that some of that production may have been sold off the farm. So there's some fairly standard practices, but they all tend to be a little bit arbitrary in terms of basically how the accounting works. And so, under the project with the patterns and determinants of cost of production at Wisconsin dairy farms, Kevin Bernhardt's going to come up with a really good answer to that question and show you some real data, since he's the guy who is really the cost of production guy. So I'll pitch that one off to him. If you're watching, Kevin, I'm sorry about that, throwing you under the bus. Okay. Okay. I think my goal was to finish right around this time so that folks could get back to the things they need to do. But thanks a lot for arranging this. Thanks, Maria and Elizabeth, for setting us up. Steve, you're back there somewhere doing great things, but thanks for setting up all that. Oh, behind the wall. Okay, got it.
So before you go, thank you, first of all, for a great presentation. I do want to put on your radar, May 18th at 11 a.m. is when Joe Pierre will be doing next month's seminar. So we'll hear about these great ideas he has had. He's been regaling me with them, Denise and others, so I'm sure it'll be a really exciting presentation. So Chuck, thank you for kicking off our series, and hope you can all join us again next month. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot.
Behind the wall.
Thanks, Steve.